Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Clements, the director of the Toda Peace Institute, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome all of the parties in the room here and 170 people who are watching online to this book launch of the book edited by my colleague Ramesh Thakur on the Nuclear Ban Treaty, Transformational Reframing of the Global Nuclear Order. We have copies there for those who haven't received one already. Please pick one up because the price is outrageous and most people on a normal salary can't afford to buy it. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all here. We prepared the papers for this book before the TPNW States Parties meetings, so we haven't been able to take into account the huge achievements of that meeting in establishing an action plan for the TPNW and for establishing its seriousness as a serious arms control treaty. But I have two people who I would just like to introduce you to. Ambassador Alex Kmentt has just finished an absolutely brilliant job of presiding over and chairing the first state parties meeting, and the success of that meeting hinged to a very large extent on his diplomatic ability, his willingness to find the right people to write the right documents, and to bring them all together in a final consensus statement. To give you some example of how important this was, I've never been to a multilateral meeting which has actually been able to adopt a consensus document 40 minutes before the end of it. So that's an achievement in itself. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ambassador Kmentt, and he can make a few comments, largely about the treaty, and then Ramesh will talk about the book.
Well, thank you so much for the very kind and generous introduction, and of course it's a pleasure to be here on this occasion of the book launch. We just concluded yesterday evening, we concluded the 3-day first meeting of states parties of the TPNW, and that of course is an extremely important moment in the life of a treaty. First of all, you start with conceiving the idea of a treaty, then you build political momentum, then you fight that you get a negotiating mandate, then you actually negotiate the treaty, then you have to try to get it into to enter into force, and once all of this is achieved, then you have to decide what are you going to do next. And I think that's really what the first meeting of states parties is for, to take into account that it's a new phase in this treaty. It's now about the implementation, and I think my colleagues from states parties really exemplary spirit of cooperation, very constructive way of working the whole preparation process. We were determined that we wanted to get this right, because of course all of us understand the contestation around the nuclear weapons issue more broadly, but also on the TPNW in particular. So it was important to get this right. It was important to demonstrate the seriousness, as you said, not just about the way we're working, but also the seriousness about the arguments on which the TPNW is based. And that's already the second point, and I think a message that came out very strongly of this meeting is the concern about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and the risks of nuclear weapons, and the increasing evidence and facts that we know about it affecting the security of every person on this planet and every country on this planet. So that was what we were trying to do at the meeting of states parties, and of course against a backdrop that is extremely negative, specifically also when it comes to nuclear weapons, with explicit nuclear threats having been made by Russia only recently. So, as I said in the meeting, virtually every indicator, or key performance indicator, if you want to use this project management term, every key performance indicator on the nuclear weapons issue points very much in the wrong direction, except the TPNW, which is the one thing that tries to point in the right direction and into a different paradigm away from reliance of nuclear weapons. There was tremendous interest from the public, media, from youth, from stakeholders who are often disenfranchised in the nuclear weapons debate, underscoring the point that this is not just an issue for a few countries that have these weapons, but the increasing recognition in a sort of common and global security approach that these are issues really of vital concern to everyone. I was extremely impressed about some of the very substantive and profound statements from many states from all parts of the world, from the Pacific Island states to Africa, Caribbean states, making very profound statements on this issue. So the point I want to make is really that for anyone who didn't pay any attention to the TPNW until now, well, maybe it's time to do a bit of reading up. And of course, there's a good book. I think there is still not enough writing about it. I think academia is slowly starting to catch up to write about this treaty, but it's still, the nuclear weapons discourse is still very dominated by the traditional approach, for lack of better expression. I think it's important to take these arguments seriously because they are profound arguments, and I hope there will be much more writing about this. And of course, also the interest in the TPNW will increase. So it's important to be informed about it and not to politicize the debate, but actually take the TPNW and the arguments and the actors as well seriously and engage in these arguments. So I think there's this book is a good segue into that.
Thank you very much. Ramesh, over to you for some insight into what's in the book.
Thanks, Kevin. I've entitled my presentation about the book, The Path from Nuclear Prohibition to Disarmament, Roadmap, Roadblocks, and Speedbumps. In January last year, for the first time, a global treaty came into force outlining the bomb, the most significant multilateral development in nuclear arms control since the NPT's treaty into force in 1970. A year later, Routledge published this book, edited book, on the ban treaty. 𝘕𝘳𝘢𝘗 𝘕𝘢𝘁, a name that will be familiar to many of you, a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing in 1945, celebrated the adoption of the ban treaty at the United Nations in 2017 by noting that nuclear weapons, always immoral, were now also illegal. While that claim may be debatable, there is no doubt that the TPNW establishes a new normative settling point on the ethics, the legality, and the legitimacy of the bomb. The book's chapters are written by many people familiar from the worlds of academia, think tanks, foreign ministries, and civil societies. Several of the authors, I'm pleased to note, are here today for this celebratory occasion. A number of recurrent themes run through the 32 chapters. I think it's important to state at the outset that not one author questions that the NPT has been a critical pillar of the international security architecture for half a century. There would be seriously damaging consequences were it to collapse. That said, doubts gradually increased as to whether the NPT may have reached the limits of its normative potential for advancing the cause of nuclear disarmament. This is one reason, among others, why, despite its proven resilience, the NPT was and is facing unprecedented pressure. If the possessor states and the umbrella states are not prepared to give up nuclear weapons, what have the non-nuclear weapon states got to lose by withdrawing from the NPT? Perhaps more pressingly, is the threat of withdrawal their one remaining effective leverage on the policies of the nuclear armed states? That's a genuine question, not an assertion. Regardless of what one thinks of the NPT's historical record in underpinning strategic stability, in recent years, nuclear risks have grown with heightened geopolitical tensions, additional roles for nuclear weapons, blurred boundaries between nuclear and precision conventional munitions, expanding frontiers in space, cyber, and AI technologies, and sharpened rhetoric normalizing nuclear weapons discourse. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's fair to say, has also profoundly shaped the global discourse on nuclear weapons. Moreover, the transformation of the Cold War nuclear dyads into interlinked nuclear chains, some of them in geographical theaters of contiguous nuclear-armed rivals, diminishes the relevance of the traditional approaches to managing strategic stability among nuclear-armed states, not to mention the added risks from non-state actors. As Sverre Lodgaard from the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs puts it in the book, quote, "The NPT is in miserable shape, betrayed on the disarmament dimension, stuck in the Middle East, and mostly irrelevant to the Asian nuclear-armed states," unquote. An important motivation for the ban treaty was the stubborn refusal of the 5 nuclear weapon states to act on their NPT Article 6 commitment to nuclear disarmament. This background reality is indispensable for understanding the mounting frustrations among the NPT non-nuclear weapon states that gradually turned into anger and then a determination to seize control of the nuclear disarmament agenda. And we've heard a lot this morning already about the importance of agency by those actors, state actors, that were generally disenfranchised in the security discourse. The NPT was gravely weakened by this lackluster implementation of Article 6, and the ban treaty's new normative standard is an effort to redress the weakness, strengthen and complement the NPT, and complete its agenda. Reframing the debate from disarmament as a security issue into a pressing humanitarian concern was critical to the successful conclusion of the negotiations. The old paradigm had proven unable to break through what Ambassador Kmentt calls the wall of the nuclear deterrence dogma. The reframing of a traditional security debate into a humanitarian discourse had an important precedent in the Ottawa Treaty that banned anti-personnel landmines. An equally important feature of the Ottawa Treaty was the role of a state champion in the carriage of state civil society partnership to successful conclusion at an international conference or summit. Thus, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICAN, was to the ban treaty what the international campaign to ban landmines was to the Ottawa Treaty in forging a global coalition of civil society groups and like-minded states. This also facilitated a democratic shift in the nuclear debate, with non-nuclear weapon states using the UN General Assembly, the central democratic body of the international system, as the site and the forum of negotiations and adoption. The ban treaty impacts those non-nuclear weapon states countries that have relied on the nuclear deterrence-based security architecture of the alliance leaders' nuclear weapons. The NPT had camouflaged the underlying inconsistency of many states in professing to support nuclear disarmament, just not yet like St. Augustine's plea on chastity, while hosting nuclear weapons, relying on nuclear deterrence for national security, and sheltering under the nuclear umbrella of allies. Yet, there is no legal incompatibility between the ban treaty and the NPT. While the NPT had enabled the umbrella states to fudge the tensions between membership of a nuclear alliance and commitment to nuclear disarmament, the ban treaty has compelled them to confront the hypocrisy head-on. This might well explain the ferocity of their opposition. It shows the mirror of their disingenuousness to their own peoples, and they don't like it. Given their history of active promotion of nuclear disarmament, I'd love to learn the details of the internal discussion in Sweden, for example, on their decision to seek NATO membership. The nuclear weapon states and their umbrella allies have effectively formed a mutual support group whereby possession of the bomb is justified in part by pointing to the demands for nuclear deterrence-based security from the allies. The ban treaty forces the issue. Do the nuclear-dependent states intend to continue to shelter under the nuclear umbrella or start behaving like non-nuclear weapon states? In other words, the treaty has the potential to embarrass umbrella states by reopening fundamental domestic debates on the role of nuclear weapons and deterrence strategies. At the same time, says former Canadian Disarmament Ambassador Paul Meyer, to fold the metaphorical nuclear umbrella, it will be necessary to convince those sheltering under it that it is safe to come out and to recognize that the umbrella may be more of a danger than a protection, unquote. In other words, a nuclear lightning rod more than a repellent. Former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament, Angela Kane, argues that the ban treaty has converted a long-standing political aspiration into a legal framework. But the legal obligations of the treaty cannot apply to non-signatories, and the possession of nuclear weapons by 9 nuclear-armed states did not suddenly become illegal with the treaty's entry into force in January last year. Equally, however, the claim that a UN-negotiated treaty, following a UN-authorized process and conference, has no implications for the legality and legitimacy of nuclear weapons possession and practices is also implausible. Non-signatory possessor states may be placing themselves outside the law, and the balance of incentives and disincentives for states, individuals, and even companies has been recalibrated. Punitive consequences could follow in due course, says Julian Pretorius from the University of Western Cape, if patterns of practice and expectations evolve to give the prohibition the status of customary international law. So we are where we are, with the ban treaty's inaugural meeting of states parties just having concluded in this city. The NPT's repeatedly postponed 50th anniversary review conference scheduled for August, and the war in Ukraine casting a long shadow over the utility, but also the limits of nuclear weapons as a deterrent and as tools of coercive diplomacy, the wisdom of having given them up, the incentives to either acquire them or shelter under others' nuclear umbrella, and above all, the cataclysmic risks of an all-out nuclear war that no one wants, but everyone dreads. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, as you will see from the program, we have until 2 o'clock for some questions and comments on both what Alexander said and what Ramesh has said. And we also have 170 people out there watching in cyberspace, and they are free also to ask some questions as well. So I think we can conclude that this book is well and truly launched, and it will do what it will do in relation to supporting and buttressing the main tenets of the treaty.
Contributing to the serious discussion.
Yeah. So over to all of you for questions and comments. Yep, Paul. Oh yes, please introduce yourself. This is not under Chatham House rule. Everything you say is being broadcast.
Maybe use
It's on? Yeah. Okay, my name is Paul Meyer. I'm with Simon Fraser University and Canadian Pugwash Group here, and I was a contributor to the volume that Ramesh edited. And I wanted to really direct my comment to some remarks he just said. One about the dogma relating to nuclear deterrence, and I think it was Dorothy Parker once who said, "You can't teach an old dogma new tricks." And I think that applies in some way to the dogma of nuclear deterrence. A lot of what has been discussed here related to the ambiguity, uncertainty about its utility, but I think also the reality that it can't be rendered harmless. And Ramesh, I like your thought of the nuclear-dependent allies and the nuclear weapon states representing a mutual support group, and that I think raises the challenge for the rest of us. How can that mutual support group be redirected in a way that's more compatible with reducing these existential risks that we face? So I would welcome if you had any further elaboration on that score going forward.
Two more questions, and then yes, Rebecca.
Thank you. I'd like to start by congratulating Ambassador Kmentt very, very much on having taken the negotiated text of the TPNW and established with this first meeting of states parties the institutional and legal and practical arrangements that will begin to fully implement the treaty. I think this is a huge celebration, and I speak, my name's Rebecca Johnson, I speak as a long-standing member of the steering group of ICANN. And my question is really, I was struck a little bit, Ramesh, that you'd said something about the reframing security into humanitarianism, but actually the core of it was reframing the militarized version of national security that has predominated security thinking in the 20th century and leading into the 21st century by imbuing it with an understanding of the humanitarian impacts of those militarized national concepts which lead to war, and bringing into the frame what nuclear weapons actually do to people, to environments, and potentially to the whole world, even if they are used only by a fraction of the world's countries. So my question to both of you is, my question let me address Ambassador Kmentt. It was very striking that the meeting of states parties adopted things like a scientific advisory group, an action plan, as well as a very strong declaration on the banning of nuclear weapons. Could you say a little bit more about how those address human security?
So one more question before we move. Yes, Mary Lou, can you give your name and before you begin?
Thank you very much. Senator Mary Lou McPhedran from Canada. And my question is geared to the launching of the parliamentarians for TPNW during this nuclear ban week, and the fact that we saw an observer delegation from the Netherlands. It would seem largely as a result of a motion of Parliament in the Netherlands that really shifted that government. And I would very much welcome observations on that and suggestions as a parliamentarian returning, I'm sorry to say, to Canada, which refused to send an observer delegation, to our great disappointment.
Alexis, do you want to begin? Or?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca, for your kind words. I want to address the security issue that you mentioned. One of the key arguments that TPNW supporters always hear from those who are skeptical is that, yes, of course, we are all concerned about the humanitarian consequences, but the ban treaty is a bad idea because we have to take the current security environment into account. And the more we make the argument on the side of the TPNW that the concerns about humanitarian consequences and risks are based on evidence, on facts, on studies, on peer-reviewed academic work, the more that demonstrates that making the argument you have to take the security environment into account is actually at the expense of the security of those who would also be impacted by the consequences and risks. So I think it's important to be clear that the TPNW is based on a solid security analysis. It is not a peace movement treaty. It is based on a security analysis. It's not that we are a group of states parties who say we should all get along better. It's based on the argument that because of what we know on the consequences and risks, the security calculation around nuclear weapons doesn't hold up, or at least it looks increasingly uncertain. And I think that's a very profound contribution to the debate, to try to teach the old dogma other tricks in terms of engaging into this debate, because of course at the end of the day everybody wants security. So the key question is, ultimately, with everything we know about the consequences and risks, is this a sustainable way to look at security from a global perspective in the 21st century? So I think that's and I admit one can disagree about the legal conclusions that TPNW states parties have drawn, but at least we need to start having a very important discussion on this, on these profound arguments that underpin the TPNW, I think. And on the question on the roles of parliamentarians, I think that was extremely powerful. We had a large group of parliamentarians, predominantly from countries that currently do not support the TPNW there, discussing the TPNW. I think all of them being very impressed about the substance and the dynamism. And I think I'm pretty sure that the parliamentarians who were here will take this back and will talk to their colleagues, will contribute to the public discourse in their countries. And that is the way how change is ultimately going to happen, through these engagements, I think. So one conversation at a time. Thank you.
I'll go in reverse order. Mary Lou, your question is very interesting. The Netherlands attended the UN conference in 2017, and they did so against the wishes of the executive arm of government, because Parliament mandated a delegation must go and attend. And that's why they attended, but because the government decides, they didn't in the end sign. So it has that history in the case of Netherlands. In addition, to reinforce the sense that lay behind your question and comment, the fact is we've just had an election in Australia leading to a change of government, and Australia had an observer as a result of the new government's policy. And I want to tie that to Kevin and I having lived through, and Valerie, having lived through New Zealand in the 1980s as it moved to becoming nuclear free and moved quite far in that direction. And the advocates and activists, and Rebecca also has a lot institutional memory of these events as well from New Zealand, The activists work through the structures and processes of the Labour Party to change the party platform, to work to place their preferred candidates who would not abandon this in the name of realism soon as they were elected, and would hold the government to account to its party manifesto, and through that to the constituency that had got it into power. Now, of course, New Zealand, as a smaller country, has a unique set of opportunities that is available to advocates and activists to play this game. But that doesn't mean that others in other countries cannot do so as well. I think to move from the politics of street protests to political engagement with the process in order to bend it to your preferred directions is an important lesson. And not enough people, I think, study how to bring about change instead of saying we must change now, why didn't we change yesterday? So I think we do need to engage with the political reality and hold the parliamentary process to account for our preferences. And that's an important lesson. So I think it's a very good comment, but that would be my lesson, to start working with civil society and like-minded MPs to change policy. Rebecca, I take your point about the militarized national security and stuff like that. What I had in mind was something different. It's been a long time since we had a bilateral conversation directly, but I know people that I work with over the past more than a decade now have felt disheartened at the seeming prevailing complacency that with the end of the Cold War, the nuclear issue died down and is no longer as great a threat. And therefore, the gradual dwindling of numbers engaged actively in this issue. Now, over the past decade, the nuclear risks have come back to the fore, and I think Ukraine may revive the agenda. But in terms of the old framework, I think the most elegant formulation was a three-part proposition from the Canberra Commission in the mid-1980s, which was, as long as any state has nuclear weapons, others will want them. 2, as long as nuclear weapons exist, they will be used again someday, if not by design, then by accident or inadvertence. 3, any use of nuclear weapons would be cataclysmic for the whole world. That was the old security framing in 3 proposition. You then have the humanitarian consequences movement, and it has its 3 proposition as well, which is the essence of that. No country individually, nor the international system collectively has the capacity to cope with the humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. 2, it is the interest of the very survival of humanity, therefore, that nuclear weapons must never be used again, comma, under any circumstances. I emphasize the comma and under any circumstances because for some esoteric reason that is beyond my comprehension, that apparently was the sticking point for the Australian government, that particular formulation. You can talk about that with the Australian diplomats you come across. 3rd, the only guarantee of non-use of nuclear weapons is the non-existence of nuclear weapons. So it's the same argument, but there's slight reframing. And that reframing seems to have been enough to resonate once again in core constituencies and communities and draw support for the movement. That's what I was trying to get at, that it did have that impact in a way that the old framing hadn't. Underpinning both, of course, is exactly what you're talking about. Historically, wars have served certain functions. I think it's one of the most damaging theses with the end of the Cold War was the Francis Fukuyama thesis of the end of history. History didn't come to an end with the triumph of Western ideas and systems, both political and economic, and values at the end of the Cold War. The use of force remains, and it has to be combated, and we need institutional arrangements as well as normative frameworks to guide us through this, so that the functions that war historically performed can now be performed by peaceful avenues. And for all that, those were important. Paul, I think it goes back to the same old thing, that it is not enough to condemn as evil or immoral countries and actors that want to rely on this. I think we need to convince them that in their own self-interest, the humanitarian impacts for them as well as the rest of the world will exceed any conceivable benefits, and to demonstrate how the security needs can be met, reasonable, legitimate security needs can be met by non-nuclear alternatives. And that's why the phrase, the reference that has already been made by Cesar and by Nobu to the Four Horsemen argument, that the world free of nuclear weapons is not the existing world minus nuclear weapons, that becomes relevant. I think we haven't paid enough attention to the institutional arrangements to underpin the new nuclear weapon-free world that we'd like to have. And until that is done, it is going to be difficult to convince everyone that all security needs can be met under a non-nuclear alternative. So we do have to address that as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm 𝘕𝘐𝘦𝘕𝘠 from Princeton University. I'd like to ask both of our speakers, if I might, following the title of the book that we're discussing, the Transformational Reframing of the Global Nuclear Order. There's a sense in which the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is part of an ongoing transformation, not just of the global nuclear order, but of the global order overall. And that was there in some of the comments that were made earlier. And I'd just like to ask both of them, our presenters, to perhaps share their thoughts on this larger transformation that is taking place in our human community over recent decades, and where they think this process is unfolding in terms of the relationship between what we used to have as a special term that was invented, superpower, as opposed to just great power, as opposed to major powers, as opposed to other states, and then developing states, in other words, states that aren't even real states, and people. So I'm just wondering if they'd like to share their thoughts on to what extent and in what ways the TPNW manifests some of those larger changes, and how it relates to where these changes may be going, given the other changes that we also see taking place in the world at this time.
Thank you very much to the presenters, and congratulations on the edited volume. I'm Cesar Jaramillo with Project Plowshares in Canada, as well as the Canadian Pugwash Group and ICANN. The question has been posed about the compatibility of the TPNW with the NPT, and it has been addressed. A related question that I'd like to ask is about the compatibility of the TPNW with NATO commitments. Whenever NATO members, nuclear umbrella states have been asked to join the treaty or to attend the meeting as observers, an off-cited reason for not doing so, those that did not, has to do with NATO commitments. And there are commitments that purportedly outweigh any other considerations and would be, in their view, utterly incompatible with the TPNW. So I wondered what your take was on this real or perceived incompatibility between TPNW and NATO commitments. Thank you.
Questions in this round? Ambassador from Mexico, do you want to say something? Okay. Rakesh.
My name is Rakesh Sood. I'm a former Indian diplomat, and I had the privilege of contributing a chapter to this publication. I would like to ask the panelists a question. Now that in 2022, we have already seen the first meeting of the ban treaty, the TPNW, and we will have the NPT review conference. How do you look at the dynamics in terms of the complementarity between the two, or otherwise, particularly when you look at the role of nuclear weapons? I mean, how can that be reconciled, as it were? And can the two work together, or are we setting the scenes for greater confrontation?
Alex, do you want to tackle some of these big questions, challenge to the global order?
Yes, not very easy questions, all of them. Let me start first with Cesar's question on NATO compatibility. There is a very interesting Norwegian study on this issue that makes the point that NATO membership in itself is not incompatible with the TPNW. The NATO refers to itself only since 2010 explicitly as a nuclear alliance. What of course would be incompatible are certain nuclear weapons related activities, most definitely of course nuclear sharing, but probably also being part of the nuclear planning group. But what this study then argues is that there would have to be a disassociation from those aspects, but that being member of a military alliance in principle and also of a military alliance like NATO would not be incompatible. There are of course other voices, and that hasn't been studied in detail yet more than that, because none of the NATO allies have thus far looked at this in very much detail. Now, Zia's very big question is very hard to answer. I hope that Rakesh will have more profound things to say than I do. But of course, the TPNW, I mean, first of all, your general point, what sort of order we're talking about, that's of course a big question in itself. And when we talk about nuclear weapons, we should probably talk rather about order. We should talk about status quo, I think. So the question is the transformational potential of the TPNW vis-a-vis the current nuclear status quo, which is of course extremely entrenched and ingrained. But of course this debate plays against the backdrop of many trends that have nothing to do specifically with the nuclear weapons issue. For example, the challenge to the post-World War II system, the permanent membership of the UN Security Council, for example, the concept of national security versus collective and common security. And I think the TPNW is interesting and attractive and important also in this context, because it is the democratization of the nuclear weapons debate. It was adopted through the General Assembly, which of course is based on the principle of equality of states, which is a great idea after the Second World War, and we're seeing it actually being disintegrated in front of our eyes. So the TPNW states parties, I think, investing or sort of reinvesting into that concept, that they do have a say, they do have agency on this issue. And then, of course, the really important sort of the transformational potential is on the argument that underpin the TPNW in the nuclear weapons debate. And there, I think we talked about this in the morning meeting. It's the juxtaposition between the assumptions that underpin a lot of nuclear deterrence, the insecurities, the uncertainties, and they are being juxtaposed by the TPNW approach with the evidence on humanitarian consequences and risks. And then the conclusions that need to be drawn for the security for all. I think that's the important thing. So not the security perspective for individual countries in a localized security context, but because of the global and transboundary and catastrophic consequences really from a global perspective. And that, I think, is a very, very powerful transformational potential, hopefully as was said in the discussion just before, leading to the conclusion that ultimately it's in the security interest of everyone. We cannot continue to rely on this hugely uncertain security paradigm in the long run. I also wanted to make the point that from the TPNW perspective, we are making the realist argument for nuclear disarmament, yeah? Based on facts and evidence, and we're putting this against the assumptions that underpin nuclear deterrence. And the argument is essentially believing, against the background of what we know of the consequences and risks, believing that nuclear deterrence will hold for the next 70, 80 years. That's wishful thinking. So it's more the realist disarmament point versus the utopian belief in the dogma that is going to hold. And maybe I've spoken too far, and I'm glad to pass over Rakesh's also very difficult question to Ramesh.
I'm actually not going to address Rakesh's question directly, but I will answer it tangentially in my answers to the other two questions. And I'll begin with Cesar and then move to Zia, because I think Zia raises some very profound, big issues in the question. I was going to address some of them earlier, but my two fingers went up too late and they were mutilated, cut off at the joints. Cesar, I think your question touches upon the phrase that was used in the first session about the Eurocentric security interpretations of where the world is. NATO has been the dominant collective defense pact since the end of the Cold War, and it has expanded its remit to cover the world. If you go back to the announcement of the AUKUS agreement in September, the Australia, UK, US agreement, security agreement, most of Asia reacted with considerable antipathy and animosity to that. Just go back in mind and think of the symbolism. In the year 2021, we have 3 white leaders of 3 Anglosphere countries telling Asians how they are going to manage Asia's security order. Just bear that image in mind as I go through what I want to say. In the earlier session also, I noted with interest a comment about critical of relativizing interpretations of and responses to what's happened in Ukraine. I think that's a mischaracterization of how what happens and how it happened. Let me give you 2 alternative statements about NATO to come to your question. Both are true, factually true, but they are completely different in the implications that flow from them. One, and the dominant one in the media, mainstream media, and in the academic analyses, at least in the English-speaking world that I follow, is that NATO is the alliance of all the world's leading democracies and reflects their interests and values. Absolutely true. It is also true that every single major power from Europe that was a colonial power is a member of NATO. That is factually true. Now, to someone who grew up in India as an independent country, we remember that Portugal, a member of NATO when it was anything but democratic, redesignated its possessions in India as provinces of Portugal, which legally made it permissible to station a NATO base on India's territory that Portugal claimed was a province of Portugal. And Secretary Dulles said, yes, that interpretation is correct. Now, thankfully, they didn't act on that when the Indian Army went in. But we take a slightly shall we say, jaundiced approach to NATO stemming from our history, colonial history. And that is important to remember. It's not a question of relativism. It's you approach things through the prism of your experience and your history and your identity. And I'm not going to go into the details of NATO's compatibility. I think it's a very interesting question. I think NATO's compatibility vis-a-vis UN Security Council is also an issue. There are times when NATO acts as the enforcement arm of authorized operations by the UN, other times when it acts independently. And it raises all sorts of questions about compatibility with the Article 51 of the UN Charter arrangements for regional defense. But if you flip that question, a major limitation of the NPT for me, from my point of view and my interests, is that of the 4 nuclear weapon possessing countries in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, 3 are outside the NPT. So from that very simple fact, NPT has extremely limited utility in regulating the nuclear order in Asia, which is one reason I'm not all that interested in the NPT. It doesn't cater to my interests and my concerns. And simply saying that possession of nuclear weapons by India and Pakistan, North Korea is a special case, but India and Pakistan is illegal and illicit vis-a-vis the NPT, and that's the end of the discussion. That's not going to take me very far. So I'm limiting that. And that takes me to the big question. I want to come back to Zia's big question because it is important. In the first session, and because the first session was under Chatham House rules, I won't give the names, but you'll remember the discussion we had. One person mentioned the key fact, which is true, that to understand the NPT, you have to remember that it is nestled within the liberal international order, which was created and its institutions were set up under the leadership of the United States by mainly the North Atlantic powers, with some input. This is the liberal international order. And NPT comes in that, although obviously Russia is an important partner in that. But it reflects the geopolitical world of that time. You have the standard argument under realism in academic discourse, which informs a lot of actual state practice, that international politics, like all politics, is a struggle for power. I think since the end of the Second World War, but even earlier, since the start of the 20th century, we've been engaged in a long struggle to transform that closer to the fact that international politics is a struggle for the ascendancy of competing normative architectures based on a combination of power, principles, and governance ideas. It's all 3 together. You can't just focus on one. And as the world transitions with a relative decline in the hegemony of the European powers and then the United States, and the rise of some of the others, the Western countries, I think, have lost irretrievably their ability to set and control the agenda and design and manage the mechanisms and institutions of global governance. Again, it's a fact of history. As power transitions occur, the rising powers will demand a greater say in designing the institutions and managing the institutions, so that the control mechanisms are no longer located exclusively in Western capitals. Now, this is putting the Westerners in a very uncomfortable position with major questions of psychological adjustment, because for the first time in several centuries, you have the potential of a global hegemon that is not English-speaking, that is not liberal democratic, that is not capitalist. The idea that they will not be able to control all this makes them very uneasy. But it is part of that historical transformation that happens. Now, the thing to remember is that China emerging as a major power is a reversal to the dominant pattern of history. It's China being subordinate that's the exception and the deviation from the historical norm. But China doesn't have a tradition of acting as a great power in a system of great powers globally, so it has to learn. But the United States doesn't have the tradition of working alongside a genuinely multi-dimensional peer rival. The Soviet Union was one-dimensional. Even that historical memory, institutional memory has been lost. So part of the stress that we are facing arises from this fracturing of the liberal international order and its institutional manifestations. Part of that is the Security Council, as presently composed with the 5 permanent members with the veto power, is the center of geopolitical gravity in the world order. But the center of normative gravity always has been the General Assembly. And with the Ban Treaty, for the first time in history, the United Nations General Assembly adopts a major security treaty against the united and combined opposition of all the 5 permanent members. So you have the democratic shift of legitimacy and agency from the Security Council to the General Assembly. Not surprisingly, the geopolitical powers that run the Security Council are not happy with that. So yes, absolutely, Alexander is right. The Ban Treaty is both a manifestation and a reflection and mirror of this changing global order, which goes back to what I was saying in rephrasing the realism thesis. And somehow we are going to have to navigate our way through this, because we are in flux. Whether we fall victim to the Thucydides trap of major war accompanying 75% of power transitions over the last 500 years, or whether we manage through our creative genius as a human race to find a way around it, remains an open question. But, and I'll finish with this, the underlying assumption behind the whole movement for the Ban Treaty was the recognition that we cannot cope with the humanitarian consequences. Our shared destiny as a human family impels us to work towards abolishing that. At the end of the day, only those who have the weapons can get rid of them. But what the rest of us can do is saying, as human beings, we have a stake. We are full and legitimate stakeholders, and we want to have a voice in shaping our destiny. We recognize the difficulties, we recognize the real constraints you face, but what we don't accept is the permanent deferral of this effort in the name of the existing security situation is inimical to that cause. If that is the case, we'll never get there. And the fact is that nuclear weapons contribute to that adverse security environment. Is the world safer today from what has happened in Ukraine because nuclear weapons exist? I think it would be impossible to make that claim. So that's where we end up, and that's why I think it is a transformational reframing. I think the nuclear armed states are wrong in trying to belittle it, trying to ignore it. I think the agenda is going to grow and colonize the discourse gradually so that they will have to address instead of ignoring it.
Alex would like to make a comment on Rakesh.
Yes, I'm sorry because you asked an important question. I didn't want to not answer to it. It was the question to what extent the TPNW and the sort of the position ingrained in the TPNW will impact on the NPT. Well, I just wanted to say that these are positions that many non-nuclear weapon states have had for decades. I don't believe that the TPNW expresses a different position on nuclear disarmament for Mexico or for Austria or for Thailand. It's been the same position for many years. It just wasn't able to articulate it in the NPT context because that order or that status quo is set in a way which of course very clearly disenfranchises the non-nuclear weapon states. And maybe now the difference is that we have actually a legal framework where we can articulate these positions and we've just done that yesterday with the final declaration, and we bring our traditional points on nuclear weapons into the NPT with a further strengthening of a legal treaty in force and consensus decisions that back these positions up, and that will have an impact on the NPT dynamic to some extent. But it's not new positions. It's maybe backed with additional arguments, but the positions, I think, have been there. The positions on the illegitimacy of the threat of mass destruction, all of these are traditional positions of many non-nuclear weapon states over decades. I think it's just now additionally backed up and reinforced with this new legal framework and an additional set of arguments.
Thank you. Tarek, we have 3 people online wishing to come in, so I'll take those questions now. Noah, do you want to give those questions, and then we'll move on to you, Tarek, for them.
Thank you, Kevin. There are many very interesting questions coming in online, so I've had to narrow it down to 3. First comes from Andreas Brischel, who asks to Ambassador Kmentt, what has convinced the most recent new parties to the TPNW to ratify? What has convinced them exactly now, and what can we learn from it for convincing future new parties to ratify? The second question that I will read is from Dr. 𝘕𝘁𝘐𝘁, who asks also to Ambassador Kmentt, what if Austria joined NATO like Finland and Sweden? Who in the EU would build the bridge to non-aligned signatories of the TPNW in the global south? That is from Dr. 𝘕𝘁𝘁𝘁. And finally, Ambassador Ali Sultaneh, who I'm sure many of you know, has a comment that you may wish to respond to. Ambassador Sultaneh says, while he commends the attempt, including the conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, there is a concern that the process the TPNW started, he calls that the eve of augmentation of pressure by non-nuclear weapon states on nuclear weapon states at the NPT. He says there is a possibility of collective action at the 50th anniversary of the NPT and perhaps the collective withdrawal, he provocatively adds, unless the nuclear weapon states start immediate action. So he ends his comment with, unless we do see some mobilization of non-nuclear weapon states against the nuclear weapon states in action and non-compliance for the last half of a century, the TPNW should not play the role of diffusing pressure, so to say, taking pressure off of the NPT for action. So that was from Ambassador Ali Sultaneh of Iran.
I think they're all to you, Alex.
Several states have ratified the TPNW in the recently. Guatemala, one of them, Timor-Leste. I don't know about the specific domestic debates there, so I don't want to comment on it. I just want to say it's we should rather look at it differently. There are many states that want to join the TPNW, and it's rather really astonishing how many have already done that, despite the very considerable pressure that is applied not to. So I think the arguments are there. It's just it's very contested, and there is significant pressure, which we actually addressed in the declaration. So maybe that's my answer to that. The question of Professor 𝘕𝘁𝘁𝘁𝘁, if Austria joins NATO, there's been a little bit of an increase of this debate in the last few months in the reaction to Russia's aggression, but it seems very unlikely that this debate is going to increase in Austria, at least in my view. We have a constitutional status as a permanently neutral country, which continues to be very strongly supported by the majority here. So of course I cannot predict the future, but it seems unlikely. But in any case, if this debate would be coming up strongly, we equally have a constitutional law against, which is called the Nuclear-Free Austria, which applies both to nuclear energy, but it also has domestic constitutional level legislation, which makes us a sort of mini nuclear weapon-free zone. So any NATO debate, any proper NATO debate in Austria would run against very strong, constitutionally and broadly supported concepts of neutrality and nuclear free. So it's very, very difficult to see how that would go. I don't see this moving further in Austria. It's interesting that maybe we even have a stronger emphasis on neutrality in Austria, whereas obviously in Sweden and Finland the conclusions were drawn in a different way. In Austria it's probably an even stronger emphasis on neutrality, which of course is explained by our own historical experience, I would say. And to Ambassador Soltani's question, I've also had discussions with Tom and Julian. I do not see at all any dynamic among the TPNW states parties, none whatsoever, to challenge the NPT, to withdraw from the NPT. Nobody has said it, nobody wants it. Quite the opposite, very clearly. The strongest commitment to the NPT is expressed by ratifying the TPNW. That's, I think, how the TPNW states parties see it. So it's really, it's the investment into the multilateral framework that is under severe pressure, and the NPT, as we all know, is under particularly severe pressure. So we're investing into the TPNW in order to reinforce this. So I don't see this at all. And I also would say that a sort of symbolic, I do not believe that a symbolic walkout from the NPT would suddenly lead the nuclear weapon states to, in panic, throw away their weapons. It's just not going to happen. So I think it's not the right approach, and nobody in the TPNW membership thinks about it or talks about it or wants it. So I think it's also a bit of a false argument from those who actually want to deflect from the real discussion.
Thank you. Tarek?
Thakur Rauf, formerly head of the IAEA's NPT delegation. So I had a question both for Ambassador Kmentt and also for Professor Thakur. Alexander, in 1996, the International Court of Justice considered the opinion on the illegality of nuclear weapons, and it sort of ruled that for cases of self-defense, it might be legal to use nuclear weapons, but to do it in a way that the damage caused would be proportional to the damage inflicted on the aggrieved party. So now that we have the TPNW, where do you think that 1996 opinion of the International Court of Justice stands, and is it now time to ask the International Court of Justice to rule on this issue once again in the context of the new realities of the TPNW and the consideration of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons? And my question to you, Professor Thakur, is about his use of the term liberal international order. I'm glad he did not use the word rules-based international order. But why is it that the proponents of the liberal international order support murderous dictators in other parts of the world, fight proxy wars in other parts of the world, provide arms to areas of conflict, engage in military interventions, engage in coups? So is this liberal international order only for themselves and some form of illiberal international order for others, or is this a civilizing mission to civilize the people in the other parts of the world through the use of these two particular concepts of the liberal international order and the rules-based international order? Thank you.
Can I take that as a statement rather than a question?
No, it's a question. I'd like you to pronounce on it.
You want me to answer that? Yeah, sure. Look, Tariq, the reality is every country acts on a mix of principles and material interests. Consequently, every country exhibits strands of inconsistency, either over time or at any given time on other issues, and reacts to the same set of circumstances depending on who the actor is and whether it's a friend and ally or an adversary and potential enemy. So yes, in Australia, we will condemn the downing of the Malaysian airliner, but we will keep quiet about the Americans shooting down an Iranian airliner, commercial airliner, flying its flight. That's true of every country. And therefore, I mean, I did an article recently where I said double standards is the norm in foreign policy. And we accuse others of hypocrisy and double standards and ignore our own. But that is true of every country. You act on a mix of interests and principles. If interests are not involved, happy to give priority to principles. If interests are involved, then you have to decide which one you think. And the reality is that most Western countries have got away with it over the past few decades because they were the dominant powers. That is becoming less sustainable. In my view, one of the most interesting and important studies in recent times was one that was conducted by Chatham House in London, measuring elite opinion in Europe and Asia separately in terms of perceptions of the United States. And it was a very clear divergence where Europeans essentially have a much more benign view of US role and power in world affairs, and Asians were much more censorious of US double standards. And essentially, to use retroactively a Trumpian line, they said American administrations, regardless of which party is in power, act in terms of America First principles, with less concern for others. So you already have this strong demonstration of difference between how Asians and Europeans perceive the United States. So this goes back to this whole conception of, because Westerners dominate both mainstream media internationally, at least in the English language, and academic discourse, they tend to conflate what is essentially a local consensus within the North Atlantic community into a global consensus. And in response to Ukraine, for example, they said, okay, China, we expected this, that's fine, but they reacted with shock to why India was acting like that. And I've been very pleased to see that the Indian foreign minister has hit back quite forcefully in language, in rhetoric, on that, and pointing out that, look, if it's a European security problem, it's a global problem, and everyone should respond. If it's our security problem, that's a local issue, and you deal with it. That world is gone. So I think there is that element, and this is one of the issues that I think some countries with a history of being very censorious are going to have to learn to be a little less judgmental and a lot more humble in recognizing that other countries attempt to strike a balance in terms of their own priorities between interests and principles, and they have their reasons for doing so. And how can we find common ground rather than saying you're being immoral in not taking advantage of this? And it goes the other way around as well.
We also want to two-finger on presumably this
you have a
committee.
question for
Yes,
well,
but
I do later.
You'll do later. Okay, then Alex, the question about ICJ and...
Yes,
Depends on which
thanks.
country you're talking
The Asian nations.
about. Japan is also in Asia.
Okay, we'll have this conversation later. Alex.
Thank you. On the ICJ, it hasn't been discussed in the TPNW community. I can't exclude it for the future. My personal view is that I'm not sure that the nuclear weapons issue is going to be settled by an interpretative decision by the ICJ. I think the better approach is rather take nuclear weapon states' word if they say they would only use nuclear weapons in conformity with international law and international humanitarian law, to have a discussion how exactly this would happen, what are the circumstances, what are the scenarios, what are the targets, and if then what's left in then predominantly very hypothetical scenarios where the use of nuclear weapons would be potentially legal, whatever, in the Gobi Desert or something like that, leaving aside the environmental law, then make the question about what does this mean for the remaining utility of nuclear deterrence. So I'm not sure if this legal approach through the ICJ is going to be taken sometimes later in the future. I'm not sure if that's if that is actually the approach that will sort of settle once and for all this really difficult issue.
Can I just add to that, Tariq? I think the advisory opinion from '96 represents the high water mark of the normative delegitimization effort in terms of the judicial machinery that we have internationally. You can never be confident about another opinion from any judicial body. So your risk is, if you go down that route, that they may actually weaken and water it, and that would be a setback.
There are many, many more issues that are on the table, but it's 2 o'clock, and on behalf of all of you, I'd just like to, again, thank you all for your attendance, and especially the 170 who are watching online. I want particularly to thank Ramesh for his, and all of the authors for their writing of this book, and finally, since I know you have to move away soon, I want to kind of pay a special thanks again to Alex for introducing kind of humane sanity into a world of insanity so that we might have some hopefulness to look forward to.